Hello everyone, my name is Hunter, and I am once more returning with part 2 of my lecture series where I try to teach stuff on the lungs. So this time I'm doing my supplemental lecture to Week 1 Lecture 10's Ventilation and Perfusion 1. Once more, my goal with this is to help supplement everyone's understanding of what's going on with the respiratory system from a bit more of a chemistry and physics perspective. Before watching this lecture, I recommend watching my previous lecture if you have not already. Just as a heads up, we are going to be doing a lot of math today, so mentally prepare yourself for that. However, I hope to be able to give some intuitive understanding and direction for where everything comes from today. I hope that I'll be able to help y'all be as happy and smart as this happy pair of lungs in the top left. Let's get started. This will be the order of today's lecture. It seems to me like the three main takeaways from Lecture 10 were the three main equations. So the Bohr equation, the alveolar ventilation equation, and the alveolar gas equation. So I'm going to do my best to work from the ground up to try and explain each of the fundamental concepts that go into each of these equations, and then I'm going to try and derive each of the equations for you. Once more, if you're wanting to ignore the math-heavy stuff, check the description for timestamps to be able to jump around. Lastly, if you have any feedback, such if you spot any errors in these videos, please reach out to me or group me. Although I have really been researching a lot of these topics super heavily over the past, oh my gosh, almost a week now to make this video, I still might miss things / make mistakes. On that note, let's dive into respiratory volumes. So there's a further elaboration I need to make on the concept of respiratory volumes and capacities that I covered in my previous video. And that is that although I think the diagram I used before was good for learning the volumes conceptually, it didn't really show them to scale, and I think that's important for understanding these equations going forward, so I'm going to correct for that now. Off of healthline.com, I was able to find values of the averages of some of the volumes, but they were given as averages for both men and women, with women generally having smaller volumes and capacities compared to men. So for total lung capacity, and all these in milliliters by the way, total lung capacity was 4,300 for women and 5,800 for men. IRV was 2,100 for women and 3,000 for men, and vital capacity was 3,400 for women and 4,600 for men. Oh, and tidal volume was 500 for both. So being that this is the year 2021, I feel like we're beyond the age of unscientifically using a male's statistics to explain the respiratory science of both men and women. Committing that kind of scientific sin just doesn't sit right with me. So instead, I'm going to commit the sin of averaging these bimodal distributions to instead concoct a model that is unrepresentative of both men and women equally. So with that, we would get an average 5,000 milliliters for the TLC, 2,500 milliliters for the IRV, and 4,000 milliliters for the vital capacity. So then we can use all of these numbers to solve for the remaining volumes and plot all of them to scale. So here we now have the before and after version of each of the volumes and capacities to scale. Additionally, I'd matched the height of both graphs to have the same total lung capacity. So where my previous diagram has showed a tidal volume that was about equal to the FRC approximately, here we can see that in real life the tidal volume is probably going to be almost like a fourth of the FRC. So the tidal volume is much less significant than was previously construed by the diagram. I think that's important for a lot of the things going forward. So now we're going to do a deeper dive into these ratios of volumes. But first, let's get a side-by-side of this new diagram with the fuller respiratory tract. So now that we have both this graph and these diagrams together, we can start to discuss and label the concepts of minute ventilation, alveolar ventilation, and dead space. Minute ventilation is analogous to cardiac output that we learned about in the heart, i.e. it's a volume, such as a stroke volume or a tidal volume, times some frequency, i.e. heart rate or respiratory rate. Therefore, the minute volume, VE, is equal to the respiratory rate times the tidal volume, VT. It is just the tidal volume delta V times the number of times this would occur in a minute. So the minute ventilation can actually be broken down into two components, the alveolar ventilation, VA, or V alveolar, because I don't like getting mixed up with A for artery or A for alveoli. So the alveolar ventilation is approximately this 350 milliliter chunk of inspired air that ends up making its way to mix with the alveoli and contribute to gas exchange. And there's the dead space, VD, the approximately 150 milliliter chunk that doesn't end up contributing to gas exchange. So graphically, dead space would probably correspond to the upper chunk of the tidal volume. So over here would probably be dead space, and over here would probably be the alveolar ventilation. More specifically though, in the upper 150 of each tidal volume, this would be referred to as the anatomical dead space. So the type of dead space that everyone has by default, since gas exchange only happens at the ends of the respiratory tract, and it does not occur at the bronchioles and up. So this is the dead space over here. i.e. there is no gas exchange here, and that makes it dead space. And here is the alveolar ventilation, i.e. it is the portion that ends up being farther and farther down physically into the respiratory tract. So that's the area where air is pushed into it first, and then the stuff that lags behind and fills up at the very end is going to be dead space, because in the upper parts there is just no gas exchange. So here is a handy little graphic in the bottom left that I thought was helpful in demonstrating, you have this tidal volume and then you have the two components that end up either being part of the alveolar ventilation or the dead space. So at the end of inspiration, you're going to have the individual breathe in this tidal volume, and it's going to be composed of some air that contributes to gas exchange and some air that just doesn't. And that is just the nature of the anatomical layout of the respiratory system. There's just going to be some air that is not in a place where CO2 and O2 gas exchange occurs with the bloodstream. So on the subject of anatomical dead space, more specifically, a kind of wild example I found online is that technically if someone is breathing through a snorkel while underwater, they are increasing their anatomical dead space because they have added a length of tubing that the air has to be sucked in through in order to reach a zone of gas exchange. Now, there's another type of dead space that is referred to as alveolar dead space, and that would occur in the volume of the lungs that is everything below the dead space. So this is where alveolar dead space occurs. At least that's how I like to think about it. So this kind of dead space would involve the presence of something that causes wasted ventilation, i.e. where gas exchange was previously able to occur, but now for some reason it can't. So let's say with our guy right here, let's say he got a pulmonary embolism that blocked a part of the blood flow to a small section of the lung. So let's say pulmonary embolism, and it messes up this chunk of the lungs right here. So this area no longer able to do gas exchange. However, there would still be ventilation that is breathed in at here and breathed out from here as if that area did work. So this would be what is referred to as wasted ventilation, because ventilation is brought there, you did the work to breathe in and out. However, there is no ability for gas exchange to occur in this area where it previously once did. So there is a net loss in gas exchange that occurs throughout the entire respiratory system because of that one area of wasted ventilation. And that is alveolar dead space in that case. Something you get in a state of disease or in a state of injury. And the sum of these two together is the physiological dead space. Now, I think it's important to note in the tidal volume over here that each individual breath a person has only brings this like 350 milliliter chunk of alveolar volume that's like breathable air, and only breathes out that approximately 350 milliliter chunk of alveolar volume. And that's really tiny compared to the total amount of FRC you have to begin with during normal, steady, relaxed respiration. Now, in Lecture 17 on gas exchange, it was brought to our attention that there is both convection, i.e. bulk flow through the respiratory system, and diffusion, so once it's in kind of this area, just kind of goes in its own directions and naturally diffuses and evenly spreads out and redistributes its concentrations. And both of these forces work together in order to bring air molecules into the lungs and out of the lungs. And I think this really does a good job of showing that a lot of the gas exchange is probably actually just the result of this diffusion and not so much the bulk flow, because the bulk flow is really only bringing this small chunk, and there's like this huge reservoir where there's probably a lot of diffusion that's going on. It's really fascinating because we think of alveoli as these really tiny areas, but just like what they were talking about in the lecture, it's like the size of a tennis court if you actually spread out all the surface area that's encompassed here. And so there's huge amount of surface area where gas is able to diffuse itself and be able to mix very well in kind of this stagnant reservoir for gas exchange to happen passively. And though we think about how much work someone's breathing in and out is doing, and in reality, a lot more of the ability for gas to be able to exchange is probably due to the nature of gases to diffuse when in a stagnant kind of volume. So I want to dig a little deeper on another topic that I wish our professors had been more upfront on earlier in our lung lectures, which is the idea of the percent composition of gases before and after respiration. And so let's go over this now. So you can see graphically on this little pie charts I got here, and then also in this little table. The big thing is that nitrogen is basically inert in the body. So you're going to inspire, it's going to go into the blood, and it's going to leave the blood. It's going to be the same concentration because it is inert. It's just kind of in and out in passive equilibrium. We don't typically think of nitrogen like being absorbed into the bloodstream, but it's there, and I'll be talking about that more later on. Next, you have oxygen. So of course, it is there in the air we breathe, and less of it in the air we exhale. Now it's interesting because with each breath, there's about a 5% drop here in the actual concentration of oxygen. And so it's actually really interesting because the work to do this 5% really seems like it's just coming from this bottom chunk of the tidal volume, the actual alveolar ventilation. And so not even this like top thing, this isn't interacting at all. It's quite literally just that 350 milliliters again. And so in that 350 mils, each time you breathe it in and out, it's kind of doing this work of causing this bit of percentage change with a decrease in O2 in it. I don't know about y'all, but I guess going into these lectures, I would have assumed that maybe each breath would have done more work seemingly. But yeah, so just interesting to think about. I'm actually going to be diving more into this table later on, but just for now, I think it's interesting to just appreciate the percentages going in and out with each breath we have. And then lastly, so carbon dioxide is a bit of a wacky boy. It's kind of the first example that we're going to have of people just assuming something is negligible to make the math easier. So even though it's in about 0.04% of the air we breathe, I guess in like the earth or in a normal room, we just assume that to be around 0, so approximately 0% carbon dioxide, which then goes to about 4%. So interesting fact here is that, I don't know about y'all, but when I see a drop in O2 and an increase in CO2, my first thought is, shouldn't these be like a 1-to-1 ratio? But they're really not. So there is what looks like a 5% decrease in O2, whereas there is about a 4% increase in CO2. And that's really interesting. When I go into actually talking about the respiratory quotient later, this is kind of where that is derived from, and I think it's a really fascinating idea that it's not necessarily a 1-to-1 ratio, and that's actually because of the diet we have, and I'll be going into this later, but just kind of motivating where the respiratory quotient comes from. Lastly, we have water vapor here. So water vapor is a very special snowflake in this equation here, and kind of how we're going to be modeling a lot of these respiratory volumes and the actual ventilations at the alveolar level. So key things you just want to know are that the air that we breathe in is assumed to be dry. It might not be. For example, if you're living in Houston and it is a nice, hot, humid day after a rainstorm, that would be an example of where it is probably pretty saturated with water in the air, but definitely by the time you breathe it out, it is very saturated. We have very quickly reached the equilibration. The partial pressure of water vapor has risen to about 47 millimeters of mercury, i.e. just whatever it's supposed to be at the fully saturated level for the temperature of the body. All right, so let's dive deeper into exactly what this chart is telling us when it says there is some concentration in inspired air and some concentration in expired air. So I have combined a previous diagram we had from one of the previous slides, and I've kind of added a lot more of the different phases and kind of my interpretation of hopefully a good diagram for y'all to use to understand what's going on through the different steps of inspiration and expiration. And I've actually mapped it onto the tidal volume curve that I had made before. So the whole idea here is that I color-coded these kind of lungs. So that let's say this is just the system of the two lungs together. So that would be in the yellow area, so air in the lungs is yellow, and then blue is the inspired air, and green is the mixture, and exactly what happens. So we're breathing in this concentration of inspired air, and that's really easy to actually figure out concentrations of the gases in the atmosphere. And before I forget, there's like some trace gases that aren't listed here, for example, like argon, maybe helium. With trace gases, we tend to not care about those in terms of modeling the behavior of the big four gases. So yeah, we're able to measure the relative percentages of gases in inspired air pretty well. But once the inspired air is brought into the lungs, there is some inherent concentration in the lungs before the alveolar ventilation is brought in to then mix around. At the very start of inspiration, you have the FRC volume, you have these inherent concentrations in the lungs, and then you start breathing in. And as you breathe in and you stop breathing in, at first you're taking up this volume and the combination of the dead space volume and the alveolar ventilation. And then by the end of inspiration, it is then allowed to equilibrate with the surrounding areas. So where you had the yellow air that was previously in the lungs, you now have a slightly different concentration because it has a little bit of the hint of blue. And of course, this is just, a very simplified model of what's going on. But the whole idea is that we just assume the dead space volume to mean that there is just no interaction there. So we're going to treat it as such in our models. But yeah, so the alveolar ventilation, which is equilibrating with the rest of the volume that is already in the lungs. It has this new concentration because it's a mixture. The concentration of air we're breathing in is diluted by this big reservoir that it's now being introduced into. Then you have expiration. So now you're breathing out the volume you had previously brought in, and this is now another diluted sample because you've almost done a double dilution with each of these mixtures. So when you breathe out and you analyze the collection of things that someone breathed out, it's going to contain both the dead volume, so the area that didn't actually participate in mixing with the previous pool, and then this chunk of volume that did mix with what was in your lungs. It's really interesting because this whole expired air is really just the fractional average of the concentrations that are in your lungs and then the dead space. It really kind of helped motivate. Obviously, it'd be really good to figure out what's actually going on at the kind of alveolar level here in terms of gas exchanges going on there, the partial pressures of the different gases in there. So you'd have expired air with this diluted form of what's in there. So you'd have higher concentration of something like oxygen than what's truly going on in the lungs, and you'd have a lower concentration of carbon dioxide than what's truly going on in the lungs. And we expect this to be the case. We expect this to be this kind of natural dilution that occurs. And so we have the normal dead space ratio of about 0.3, i.e. the volume of dead space over the tidal volume. Because we're kind of dealing with this indirect measurement of what's actually going on here, we have to get a little creative. And so I think this kind of set the groundwork for why it's important for the Bohr's equations with actually talking about dead space and the ratio of dead space to tidal volume. All right, so real quick, I want to expand on the idea of double dilution that I had just talked about. So this is a model like what we saw on the last slide with the same color scheme, but instead I add this extra term over here to kind of show the two levels of dilution that are going on when I refer to this double dilution, and to hopefully kind of explain and help show why it's so difficult and why people have to be creative and what they're measuring and the formulas they're used in order to actually figure out what's going on at the alveolar level. So first off, let's say we have air that's inspired here on the very left side. So air can be inspired, from the room, from like a nasal cannula, or from something like a ventilator. So in any of these worlds, we are able to know what the percentages of inspired air are actually going to be, and that's what we found on that chart that we saw on the previous slide, and that's going to be popping up a lot. So we can measure easily here at this level, figure out whatever the percent concentrations are, and then once the inspiration happens and is actually brought to the lungs, there's going to be some volume at the dead space because that area doesn't interact with the alveoli, and there's going to be some that does do equilibration and gas exchange at the alveolar level, and that is the first dilution right here, where on this picture you can see the blue color is the inspired air. That's going to mix with the air that was previously in the lungs, and it's going to be a slightly less yellow total air that is shared between these two areas. So the sum of the alveolar compartments in addition to the sum that was breathed in. Okay, then when they expire, what's going to happen is that we are going to essentially be expiring two chunks of air. So one chunk of air, the dead space, that did not participate in equilibration, and then you have the alveolar portion of the air that we are breathing out, which is at the same light green concentration as the lungs got to, but once these are actually outside of the body, it's going to be slightly diluting the presence of the oxygen, the room you're expiring to, and things like that, and that would be like a really small change, and you probably wouldn't be able to notice that change over just a single tidal volume. But, let's say we had the patient breathe out into a bag, into a sealed environment. If you recall from the professor's slides, he mentioned the fact that when you first are breathing out air, you're going to be measuring air that is very low carbon dioxide, and then as you get to breathing out this air that was able to do equilibration at the alveolar level, that's going to be a higher concentration of CO2. So that's if you do like these really accurate, really specific time measurements. But let's say you just have the patient breathe out into a bag and you measure the concentration that comes out in that breath they have there. Well, this is where the second dilution happens, because once more you had the measurement of what was actually going on at the alveolar level, but that's diluted and mixed again with the volume of air that didn't equilibrate with the alveolar level, but now it's equilibrating, and it's much more influential because you're dealing with the much smaller volume of the expired air that's actually mixing here. And so we have this darker green color to signify that blue is making a much greater contribution to this volume of expired air. And so historically, this volume here can also be measured easily. But once more, the second dilution has occurred. And so what you're actually going to be measuring here is very different from what's actually going on at the alveolar level, either like before, after, or like during inspiration. So that is why people have to make these creative workarounds to actually figure out what's going on at the actual level of alveolar gas exchange, because the easiest measurements are very indirect.
And so people get very creative with approximations to actually be able to measure at the alveolar level because it'd be so difficult to actually measure what's going on there. I'm sure that machines and methods are getting easier with time as science progresses, but definitely historically, when all of these equations were based, starting from like the late 1800s to like the mid 1900s, that definitely wasn't available. And so a lot of our equations are based around the workarounds that they had to do in order to actually figure out the ability to the alveoli to do gas exchange. So now on to actually some math and some derivation. So we're almost done with the groundwork for setting up for why the Bohr equation exists, but also, how do we get there? So let's talk about the concept of mass balances, and we're going to refer to CO2 as our main gas of interest. I have this diagram on the right. I think it's really useful. It kind of tracks exactly at what part of the respiratory system would we expect different concentrations of CO2. I haven't really talked about partial pressures yet, but obviously y'all know they exist. There's quite a bit going on in this picture in the bottom right, but for now focus on the fraction of CO2 that is present in each of these little areas. So as I had said before, at the alveolar level, you actually have a higher amount of CO2 and a lower amount of O2 than you would actually find in your breath you expire, and that's because once more, the expired air is diluted with the ratios you would find in the alveoli, but also diluted a bit with the dead volume that never interacted with the alveoli. So let's get on to the subject of mass balance and the math that goes with it. Just as a heads up, for all the math I'm going to be doing throughout these lectures, there's some notational things that we should talk about. So let's compare a V versus a V dot. So V, I'm going to say here, is referring to a volume, whereas a V dot, this little dot, implies a rate. So this would be a volumetric flow rate, for example. So if volume would be in milliliters, volumetric flow rate would be in something like milliliters per minute. There were some times where I think the professor would use a V and a V dot kind of interchangeably, and I just want to clarify that I'm going to be trying to be really consistent with what I'm doing here because I want to get rid of areas of confusion already. It's already confusing enough as it is. Next, for things like PA versus P big A, no, I'm not going to do any of this. The little a stands for arterial. If there's ever an arterial, I'm going to say P arterial, and then if there's ever big A, then I'm going to say P alveoli or V alveoli, things like that. I just hate getting mixed up on both of those things, so I'm going to not deal with that. I'm just going to expand the terms I use. It might not necessarily line up with what the lectures or the formula sheets end up saying, but hopefully I'll be able to explain everything well enough that once you look at the formula sheet and it comes to the exam time, you're going to be like, oh, these all make sense, different subscripts and stuff, but Hunter explained it well enough, hopefully. So now let's get into the actual mass balance now. So let's consider an arbitrary gas X, which is present in the environment, in the body, things like that. So as a person inspires at some rate of alveolar ventilation, let's call it V dot alveolar inspire. This is the rate of ventilation that is brought to the alveoli through the subset of the tidal volume that ends up interacting with the alveoli. So in that chunk, some fraction of that inspired breath would consist of X. We're going to use F as the fraction. So F as a fraction corresponds to mole fraction, partial pressure, and in this case, volumetric fraction. This would be F, and it would be inspired with regards to gas X. Once more, we're going to be assuming ideal gas law holds true, because if not, we would have to use some very complicated equations. So next, we're going to have the person expire at some rate of ventilation from the alveoli. So this would be alveoli expire, and there is some fraction of this breath that consists of X. So I want to do a brief aside real quick, and I want to talk about the idea of fractions of gas X. So the easiest kind of analog I think we all had to learn from Gen Chem was the idea of mole fractions, i.e. you have some total amount of moles, N total, and that is comprising some mixture of substances, and using the mole fraction of each of the substances within the given mixture, you can figure out the moles of each of those substances. So, for example, there could be moles of A, moles of B, and moles of C, and each of these would have an associated fraction with them. So therefore, the total amount of moles should be equal to the sum of all of the constituent amount of moles as well. If we want to get an individual amount, so N sub A, for example, that would be the total amount of moles times the fraction of A in that mixture. So that's the case for moles, as we all remember from Gen Chem, but under the ideal gas law, PV equals nRT, If we assume the ideal gas law holds, then we can actually incorporate this as well for things like pressure fractions and even volumetric fractions. So in the case of pressure fractions, if you had the sum of pressure A, pressure B, and pressure C, the combination would all add together to make the total pressure in the system, and the partial pressure of A would be equal to the P total times the fraction of A. And additionally, this is the same with volume, so V sub A, V sub B, and V sub C, there is some volumetric total where VA would be equal to the V total times the fraction of A. Okay, so now you might be saying, whoa, Hunter, all of your fancy graphs you made show a constant tidal volume for expiration and inspiration. So why do we need different volumes for the V in and the V out? Well, that is a great question. And I have some heartbreaking news, which is that the rate of inspiration does not necessarily equal the rate of expiration, i.e. the volumes that you breathe in and breathe out are not actually necessarily the same. I know, shocker. I'm really sorry you have to go through these mind-breaking revelations. I always lived my whole life thinking that my amount I breathe in was always equal to the amount I breathed out. So in common conversation, everyone kind of treats them as the same, but they aren't necessarily the same for two reasons. So one is because of water vapor when we expire. So H2O leads to actually a V expiration that is actually greater than the V of inspiration. When we breathe in, we are breathing in the gas being dry, whereas when we breathe out, it is very saturated. So we have a net increase in the amount of water vapor in the air we breathe out. And fun fact, water loss is just a product of the fact that we breathe out water vapor and we have a net loss. And I guess that's the cost of trying to help keep the lungs in a moist environment. We lose a lot of water every day from breathing it out. Now, the other reason why they're not necessarily the same is because of the respiratory quotient. We still have not really gotten into explaining this, but the whole idea with respiratory quotient is that the amount of oxygen that is consumed is not necessarily the amount of CO2 that is produced. And so in this case, respiratory quotient will actually lead to the expired volume being less than the inspired volume because we output molecules of CO2 less than we consume molecules of O2. And so because there are these two opposing forces that result in either smaller or larger expired volume, they don't necessarily cancel out. Therefore, we'll be needing different ventilation terms just for the sake of math later on. However, for common conversation, these are typically referred to as the same volume. Deal with that as you may. So we have set up the groundwork. So now let's actually do the mass balance. So when breaking down exactly how we're going to be motivating the terms, I'm going to be using a little simplified bulb model. You can just imagine as the sum of the alveoli where stuff will be entering and leaving. So CO2, we're going to be assuming that it is 0% on inspiration. That means that the only relevant area where CO2 is going to be coming from, the capillary, there's some rate of CO2 production into the alveoli from the capillaries. So I'm going to call that VCO2 production, and that is going to result in the alveoli having some inherent concentration of CO2, or in this case, a inherent volumetric fraction of CO2 at the alveolar level with regards to CO2. So that's going to be in this space here. And then CO2 from the alveoli will be leaving through this rate of expiration. So V dot alveoli expiration, as we had said before. So if we assume that CO2 is only resulting from this production that is coming from the capillaries into the alveoli, and then we also assume that there's not some buildup of CO2 here. It's essentially over the long term a almost constant net loss in CO2 through the alveoli. We're just assuming the person's like only doing tidal volume, things like that. Then we can say that this volume of CO2 being produced is actually equal to the volume of CO2 that leaves the alveoli, i.e. it is equal to the volume that is leaving the alveoli through expiration times the fraction of CO2 within the sum of the alveoli within the lungs. We're not caring about dead volume here, we're just caring about the pure milliliters of CO2 produced from the capillaries into the alveoli, and those milliliters are then removed by expiration, and then this is the purest units of volume of CO2. And so yeah, we're going to be essentially breaking down the alveoli into equations like these for each of the three main gases, so the nitrogen, oxygen, and CO2. And yeah, so this is just a big stepping stone for what's to come next, the Bohr equation. So this is a equation that relates the volume of dead space to the total tidal volume. Now, some history quick on Bohr's equation. So this equation was actually made in 1891 in its base form, which I'm going to be deriving. So this was actually invented by Christian Bohr. So he was a physician and researcher at the time, and he is actually the father of Niels Bohr, fun fact, who ended up working on the Manhattan Project, big in chemistry and physics, and he did like the Bohr model of the atom. So it's a fun father-son Nobel laureate pair of nerds. But yeah, so just, keep in mind that if you're ever kind of frustrated with these equations, it might give you a bit of solace to know that these equations were made like 100 years ago. So I mean, it's not like boomer medicine, it's like the boomers of boomer medicine. Anyways, so Christian Bohr said that exhaled breath, VT, was a combination of the dead volume and then the alveolar volume. Very simple stuff that we are familiar with at this point. And he said, assume this does no gas exchange, and this does participate in gas exchange. Additionally, he assumes no CO2 on inspiration, a common assumption that we're going to be seeing a lot in this lecture. Using this relation, he said that VT is equal to VD plus V alveolar. Additionally, he accounts for the amount of CO2 in milliliters expired. So he says in this equation right here, there is a subset of volumes of CO2 in each of these contained areas. And he says this is the fraction of CO2 in each of these areas. Leads us to this equation here. And he says, okay, well, each of these should have some amount of milliliters of CO2 that comes from them in the expired air. But once more, if there's no CO2 on inspiration, then the fraction that you would find in the dead volume would be 0. So using that, he reduces the equation to this relation between these four variables. But keep in mind that the alveolar volume here is the same as this alveolar volume here, which means that we can say that the alveolar volume is equal to the tidal volume minus the volume in the dead space. And then we can substitute that in for this equation. So now we are left with this equation here, and I'm going to clear out some of this other stuff and make some more room. And so now we can actually rearrange this equation right here to then be in the form of the fraction of expired CO2 over the fraction of alveolar CO2. This new form here then can be further simplified into this form, which can then be rearranged into this form, which can lastly be expressed as so. And this is what Christian Bohr came up with in 1891. Now, if we make some room again on this page, we can get a better look at the equation on its own that he came up with. There's going to be two modifications that end up being historically made to his form of the equation. First off is what's going on with these fractions here? How do you even measure a fraction directly? So I believe he used volumetric fractions, but over time it actually became easier to express these as partial pressures, i.e. concentrations of a gas, by expressing it as its partial pressure in a mixture of gases. So just from before when I'd gone over fractions, so we can rearrange this to say that the fraction of a gas in a mixture of gases is equal to its partial pressure divided by the total pressure of that mixture, which means that we can convert all of these fraction terms into these partial pressure terms divided by the total pressure. And since they're all from the same total pressure, they all cancel out these terms, which then gets us to this form of the equation. So this is what our equation looks like after our first modification, which is that we change it from a fractional representation to a partial pressure representation. However, there is still one more modification that is often made to this equation, which is that these partial pressures here are not necessarily easy to measure. So it's easy to measure the partial pressure of expired CO2, but it's really hard to measure at the alveolar level, as we saw on previous slides. So the workaround for this is that we often assume that the arterial partial pressure of CO2 is approximately equal to the alveolar partial pressure of CO2. And this actually can be shown on the diagram I have in this bottom right section here. Now, it might not be the case that they are actually equal in the real world all the time. This is probably a variant in actually where you end up drawing the arterial blood from. It would likely be the case that if you drew arterial blood much closer to where the blood is oxygenated, you would probably have a much greater accuracy in the partial pressure of arterial CO2 you're measuring, in how accurate it is compared to the alveolar CO2. However, there's probably some logistical and clinical trade-off that results from having to do something like an arm blood draw for arterial blood, just so that there's less of a chance of the patient bleeding out as a result of trying to nick an artery. But I imagine clinically there have been studies that have supported either variables that will exacerbate the change between these two metrics here, but as long as the relationship holds well enough for the model to be useful for predictive patient management, then as far as I'm concerned, it just is what it is. When these equations are constructed in medicine, it's probably much more of a priority to make sure you're maximizing patient outcomes and how useful it is in a clinical setting. So regardless, as long as physicians are aware of the usefulness of this kind of equation, then this approximation can be made, and as long as it, results in good patient outcomes compared to if you weren't able to make this kind of assumption. So with this assumption, that ends up yielding our final form of the equation, which is this bad boy right here. Now, what's interesting is that in step 1, first aid textbook, they actually list this equation in this form, but on our formula sheet, I believe it is actually listed in this form. So if you just remember that they are interchangeable with regards to this equation, then I'm sure that is all that matters for y'all to remember, and you can just convert between the two forms here. So now we'll talk a bit about the actual results of this equation, what is useful and what it can tell us. So first off, just remember that the dead space here as the measurement is the total physiological dead space. It is not able to differentiate between if this is resulting from the alveolar dead space or anatomical dead space. Once more, this is an equation that dates back to the 1800s, and just being able to make that kind of improvement was probably really good compared to a world where you can't estimate any dead space. Next, an important thing to think about based on this equation is that if you're taking shallow and rapid breaths, then that means that the volume is only going to be actually penetrating into this dead space and then leaving. It's not really going to have time to equilibrate here, and so if a patient is doing shallow and rapid breaths, they are not really able to refresh the actual concentrations of O2 and CO2 that would be good for physiological function at the alveolar level. Lastly, in kind of the series of volumes here between the dead space and the alveolar ventilation here, when you first expire, you're going to be expiring this 0% CO2 from this dead space, and then you're going to hit this increased CO2 once your measurement actually starts reading from the alveolar ventilation.